we're going to start, which is source number 1, Perik Kaftet, Pasuk Tedvav. Ki atem yadatim tasher yashavnu eretz Mitzrayim v'tasher avarnu b'kerev hagoyim asher avartem. So a little historical context. B'tir'u et shekutzeihem ve'et giluleihem. Both of those are terms for idolatry, and I'm not particularly interested at this point of being overly technical in the translations, that you're going, and you saw these things that they worshipped, eitz va'even, so literally wood and stone, kesef v'zahav, silver, gold, asher imahem, which essentially means is that people who were involved in idolatry went and worshipped all kinds of things. The Vilna Gaon has a remarkable commentary to this, and in source number 2, v'tirut shekutzeihem v'edgoleim eitz v'even kesef v'zahav, shekutzeihem hi shikutz b'nei Ammon. That had to do with the worship of the people from Ammon. Giluleihem hu v'adazar shamoav, v'hu bal pa'or. So he's getting a little more technical. But then he says, Eitz ve'even, this is the part which is interesting, Eitz ve'even, hu avodah shel Esav v'Yishmael. And he doesn't explain it. So Esav is generally, in Jewish theology at least, I'm not talking about genealogy, I'm not talking about history, I'm talking about Jewish theology. Esav is connected to Rome, and Esav is connected to Christianity. So he said they worshipped the Eitz. We'll get to the rock, and you're skipping. Shwaya. You skip the crucifix. Okay, so the Eitz va'even, he says, is Esav v'Yishmael. So therefore, he says that is a reference to Christianity, which has to do with the crucifix, and Yishmael, that has to do with worshiping the rock. And again, that's why he's the Vilna Gaon. And then Kesef Azav, he continues to explain Sichon va'og. But as I said, really interesting comment. Again, this is the kind of thing you don't know what to do with it. I mean, he's trying to say that's pshat, or this is remez, or this is what emerges later on in history. No matter what you say, I'm going to say it again, that is a really interesting comment of the Gra. Continue. Pasuk Yud Zayin. Pen yesh bachem ish o isha, lest you have among you a man or a woman, o mishpacho shevid, or family or a tribe, asher livavo poneh. Now, that's already going to be the interesting part. What does it mean, libo poneh? Their hearts will be open. Libo poneh hayom me'im Hashem Elokeinu. That their hearts will be open to deviate from God. L'lecha lavod et Elohei hagoyim hahem. That they'll go and worship the gods of these other nations. Pen yesh bachem, lest you have among you shoresh poreh rosh v'la'ana. Now, we have a little bit of a challenge to translate those words. I'm going to look for a second at the Targum Onkelos on this. And again, what specifically concerns me is towards the end of that verse, lest you have among you, right? Shoresh poreh rosh v'la'ana. So he writes, Dilma it bachon gvar meharher chata'in ozadon. There are people who are contemplating within their minds sins which sound to be sins which are more accidental, which of course you can all ask me, how do you contemplate accidental sins? That is interesting. Ozadon, or things which will be deliberate. Now, the thing you should note over here is that the words of the Torah did not say anything like that. And nonetheless, Onkelos has this reputation of translating things literally. So we need to readjust our understanding of Onkelos, and I've said this many times, that Onkelos will explain not what it says, but what it means, which means 90-something% of the time, he's going to be quite literal, because what it says is what it means. But whenever something goes a little bit more poetic, then he's not going to tell you the poetry, he's not going to give you the mashal, he's going to tell you what it means. So over here as well, he's leaving these words, again, Shorish, Poreh, Rosh V'La'ana, which really sounds much more agricultural, things that will grow astray and so on. And he's saying is really the things that are growing or the things in your mind which are growing. And and as I said, he goes straight to what he believes that it means. If you look at the Targum Yonatan, which is source 4, which is the Keter Yonatan, which is the Targum Yonatan, translated back into Hebrew. Now just a word about the Targum Yonatan. There was a famous Targum Yonatan, right? This is not it. Targum Yonatan we have today only on Navi. We do not have it on the Torah. The publishers who were a little bit overzealous found a Targum and they called it Targum Yonatan. Most likely it was a Targum Yerushalmi, and it had Taf Yud, and they decided it was the more famous Yonatan. But it's assumed that it really is a Targum from Eretz Yisrael. We'll see why that may be interesting in a moment. So over here it goes back and translates, as I said, back into Hebrew, the Keter Yonatan. He's a Rusha miyesh bechem achshav v'lo ya'acharechen ben adam o isha o mishpacha o shevet shel libo poneh l't'ota yom acharei yir'ah shel Hashem Elokeinu lavod et elilei hagoyim haim Shema yesh b'chem ta'ut sheshoresh shel libo. Again, the things which are planted, he has the planting in your heart. Meharher alav acharei cheto shetchilat cheto matok v'sofo mar kicholi shel mavet. Kilana, shel mavet. Now that is so interesting because, as you noticed, I hope, that he just stuck a whole bunch of words there that were not in the Torah. But again, he is very much taking a metaphor and extending it a little bit and explaining a little bit. And he talks also about the beauty of sin, right? Sin has a certain type of beauty to it. It has an attraction to it. And over here he speaks of the beauty of sin, which initially it's sweet, and at the end, v'sofo mar kicholi, la'anash shel mavet, becomes like a poison which leads to death. By the way, some of this was actually in the words of the Torah, very little of it, but he, as I said, is extending the metaphor. That idea of sin initially being sweet and then becoming bitter actually is found, ironically or not, in the Talmud Yerushalmi. As I said, the Targum Yerushalmi, that may tell us a teaching from the Talmud Yerushalmi, should not be terribly surprising. In source 5, Amarav ibun v'hasir Hashem mikol choli. Again, a different verse. God will remove all the illness. Ze yetzer hara. That's the evil inclination. Shirosho, that its beginning, matok. It's sweet. V'sofo mar. And in the end, it becomes bitter. So, till this moment, all that we've done is we've looked at some verses, and the verses tell us something about how we're always seems to be within a larger context where there is idolatry, and we need to stay away from it, and we can't be influenced by the various kinds of societies that we have been in contact with. We need to stay away from their belief system. We need to stay away from their idol worship. And we need to realize that among ourselves as well, there is this capacity, and again, I want to look back at source number 1, back at that Pasuk Yud Zayin, lest there be among you, and it again delineates a person, a man, a woman, a family, a tribe, and so on, asher libo poneh hayom im Hashem, their heart, and I want you to pay attention to that, their heart, because of course the heart is not just talking about a pump or valves, it's not just talking about the blood flow going through the body, levavo, again, what a heart means, again, metaphorically, that their heart deviates from God. Pen yesh bachem shoresh poreh. So it's really like something wild which is growing, rosh v'la'ana, but it's something which does lead to poison. That's really what this metaphor is being used over here. If you want to read the next verse, v'yabit shema'od divrei ha'Allah hazot v'hitbarech bilvavo lemar shalom yeli. And if, when you hear this covenant that we're about to enter into, and you kind of bless yourself in your heart and say, no, I'll be okay. Ki b'shvirot libo eleich, I'm just going to follow my heart's desire. L'mansfot harava et atzme'ah. And what's going to happen, this is going to be the thing which will lead to destruction, which is really what the rest of this chapter is going to be telling us. I'm choosing, source number 6 is Rashi. So let's look there because it's always the first and best place to look. Pen yesh b'chem, shem yesh b'chem, perhaps. Asher levo poneh hayom, milakabel lev abrit. Which means this is the reason that a person may not want to enter a covenant with God, because their Yetzer Hara has taken over for them, and it doesn't allow them to go down a path which is going to lead them towards serving God. Shoresh por v'rosh v'lana, shoresh migadel esev mar kigidin shehem marim. Seeing some kind of a plant which is going to grow something which is bitter. Klomar mafre umarbe. It will cause this increasing, like Puruvu, resha bikir bechem. It's this element which causes evil to grow in our hearts. So again, yes, a lot of this is metaphorical. Nonetheless, there's some really important religious philosophy which is underneath all of this, and it's that religious philosophy that I really want to focus on. I chose source number 7, which is the Bechor Shor, and I'm going to again say this is a general rule. When we learn Gemara, for whatever reason it is, and maybe it's not the best reasons, you have the page for the Gemara, and then you have Rashi on one side most of the time, and you have Tosfot on the other side. Of all the Rishonim, Tosfot's not the easiest Rishon to learn. Rashi explains what's on the page, and Tosfos explains how this page fits in within a larger corpus of Shas, constantly bringing in references from all kinds of places, and therefore if you were lost on one page, and then you look in Tosfot, now you're lost in terms of half of Shas, because you have no idea what he's talking about, and therefore to learn one page of Gemara requires of you, very often, to learn 6, 7, 8, 10 other pages just to reference that one page. Yes, learning Gemara is very easy after you do it for around 10 years. The problem is staying with it till those 10 years, and by the way, just A, knowing that larger corpus, and then B, knowing how to negotiate within any given page and the inner logic of the Gemara. But Tosfot is a really challenging commentary, because it's trying to work out this page within a larger context. In the Chumash, whoever published the Makor Gedolot chose, again, whatever they thought would sell best. That's really what it is. Let's never underestimate that. It's sales. And Tosfot is somewhat underrated. There are, by the way, just like in the Gemara, there's actually multiple Tosfot authors. Tosfot lived in multiple countries: France, Germany, England, Italy, over hundreds of years. When it comes to the commentaries on Chumash, there's also a whole bunch of commentaries from the Tosfot school. Now, one is, I'll tell you, they're always interesting. 2, I'll tell you, there's a lot of overlap between them. So we're going to look at the Bechor Shor. Bechor Shor is one of the, again, the most famous one will obviously be the Rashbam. Rashbam, right, as a kid, and I say this all the time, as a kid he learned Chumash and Rashi, yes? Because his grandfather was Rashi, so he learned Chumash with Rashi, and that's unparalleled, but it doesn't always agree with Rashi. And sometimes you don't realize when you're learning Tosfot that his younger brother, 15 years younger, is Rabbeinu Tam. So again, that's like a pretty impressive family. And they really are different generations, by the way. And Rabbeinu Tam had far more influence than the Rashbam did. Rabbeinu Tam had a combination of 2 things. One is he was the greatest rabbi of his age, and 2, he knew it. By the way, sometimes someone doesn't know that, but he knew it, and he used his authority, and he used it well. He also had the advantage of having someone who did his writing for him, who was a nephew, a great-grandson of Rashi, who's the Ri Azaken. So the Ri, who's the Ri Azaken, he's called because there's a younger Ri, the Ri Azaken, there would be no Rabbeinu Tam if he didn't have his Ri writing and taking his notes for him. We always need our writers to keep the information and to put things together in a way that other generations understand it. But when it came to each place where the students of Tosfot, and then later on they were called the Balei Tosfot, where they were asking the same questions, they had a similar methodology, they were bringing in a lot of the same sources, and they sometimes gave different answers, but this Bechor Shor is a good representative of 6 other commentaries of Tosfot, or the various Balei Tosfot, over here. Pen yesh lechem ish o isha, asher levavo poneh hayom im Hashem Elokeinu lechet lavodet Elohei hagoyim. Right? We understood that. They're going to serve other gods. She'ein mavchinim bein tov l'ra. Now this is what I want to begin to stay with. They're unable to distinguish between good and bad. Now, I'm going to pause right here. good and bad, tov v'ra, is something which should take us back to the Garden of Eden, right? We have an Eitz Hadat tov v'ra. Also, for those of you who don't know, I have at least 7 books where the word Eden is someplace in the title. So that should also be a hint that we're always going to somehow get back here. But this is too easy. But what I want to also delineate for us right now, 3 sets of terms which we need to think a little bit how they work. The first will be Tov and Ra. The second will be Emet v'Sheker. Tov and Ra, good and bad. Emet v'Sheker, truth and falsehood. And the third will be Chaim v'Mavet, life and death. If you think about all of this, hopefully you'll realize that all of these elements are here, Netzavim Vayelach, they're right here. If you don't know, if you don't recognize, you don't remember, then look through the Parsha. If not, then pay attention when they read it in shul. All those elements are going to be here. By the way, not Emet v'Sheker is the one you'll give me a hardest time with. Sorry, truth and falsehood, but that's maybe the most important. But you also recognize that all of these elements are also right there in the 2nd and 3rd chapters in Bereshit. Although you can argue with me. No, you can't argue with me. You can't argue. No, you could. No, I'm saying, you have an Eitz HaChaim, and what's the other Eitz? The Zohar calls, what does the Zohar call the other Eitz? So by the other Eitz is Tov Ra. So you say, no. The Zohar calls the other Eitz, the other tree, the tree of death. If one is a tree of life, then the other one's a tree of death. One of them would have brought life to the world somehow to be sustained, and the other one is the one which brought death to the world. So therefore you really do have a tree of life and tree of death, and you have, again, life and death I place before you and so on. These are terms which are going to be terms found here towards the end of Dvarim, which then in a general sense should cause us to start to contemplate to what extent what we're reading here has to do with issues that started long ago, or maybe I'll put it like this. When I gave you the title in the beginning, is this a preparation for Rosh Hashanah? Well, it could be a real good preparation for Rosh Hashanah. Could it also be a preparation for something much bigger, which means meaning, am I fixing what's happened this year? Or is there a fixing which is much larger taking place in terms of going back to the very dawn of history? So that's enough for right now, and let's continue in the Bechor Shor. What's he saying? She'ein mavchinim ben tov l'ra. They have no ability of distinguishing between good and bad. Now, where did that come from? Why don't we have an ability of distinguishing between good and bad? By the way, you will have to know the answer. Well, that's what happens when you ingest from a tree, or your DNA has come from people who ingested from a tree, which is a tree of Tov v'Ra. A tree of Tov v'Ra causes there to be a confusion between Tov and Ra. And when there's a confusion between Tov and Ra, guess what follows? Well, sin, death, which lies, which means all of the negative, remember I told you there are 3 pairs that we need to think about, but all the negative seems to be somehow put together. Okay, continuing our Bechor Shor. Ve'ein memachim biyodum lasot kol asher im levavo. Pen yesh b'chem shorish, we're going to skip a little bit. Vayom mashmot divrei Allah azot. Right, k'shel libi. V'yaseh kol shelibi chafetz. And so on. Lo tavo de machshavot ra'ot halalu. So, what I'm going to say without reading everything over here is that sin, he's telling us, is going to emerge from a worldview which is tainted. And now the question is, why is that worldview tainted? And the answer will be that the worldview is tainted because there's something wrong in the way that we are looking at things. And again, just the ability over here by saying, She'ein mavchinim ben tov l'ra. How can I expect someone to choose good if they don't have an ability of distinguishing between good and bad? How do you do that? How do you choose good? Which means that what he's pointing out over here is that there's something, it's in the setup even. But by the way, if I go too far with this, you're going to say, what chance do we have? And you're also going to have a wonderful defense in terms of Yom Hadin, Rosh Hashanah, or any other Yom Hadin, to stand in front of God and say, well, what choice did you give us? You've created us with this ability to make bad decisions, or if you want differently, you've given us this wonderful thing called the Yetzer Hara. Now, what's the answer going to be? The answer is going to be is that you must also have the capacity of going against the Yetzer Hara. What's the answer? There also must be a Yetzer Tov. What answer is not just an Eitz Hadat Tov Hara, there's also an Eitz Chaim. And what's the answer is that Eitz Chaim hi lemachzikim ba, and you read that verse in Proverbs, you get very quickly to the understanding that what is that Eitz HaChaim? It's Torah. Eitz Chaim hi lemachzikim ba. That's the reason why you call the Torah Eitz Chaim. It's Torah, which means that we were put in a world where there is this confusion and there is this good and bad, and we seem to, in our hearts, we get confused and want to move towards the bad, but it's telling you, no, you don't necessarily have to do that. There is a way to move, again, away from that and make other kinds of choices. Now, as I said, there's a lot more in this Bechor Shor, but the only reason I really went here is to show you that problem, she'ein mavchinim ben tov l'ra, that he's already pointing it out. The main commentary that I wanted to get to today is the Sforno. Sforno, for those of us who don't know, first of all, he's Italian. The fact that he's Italian means that he has good taste. It means that he's stylish. He is. By the way, this is true of all the Italian commentaries. They have style. I don't know what else to say about it, and they have creativity. And the Sforno, in a certain sense, strikes me as being one of the earliest modern commentators, even though he's not that early. But there's nonetheless something very modern about him on various understandings, but there's also something very ancient. Now, he does something here that it's a little unfair, because I know what he did. I'm going to share with you what he did, but he doesn't tell you what he's doing. But by the way, again, when you look something up in Makorot Gedolah, and you see the Sforno over there, and he is one of the commentaries there, sometimes the way to get to the depth of this, and I didn't do this for this class, it's just I happen to know this, is that then you go to the editions of that commentary itself. I mean, I have 4 different editions of the Sforno at home, each one with their own footnotes, some better, some worse. And enough introduction, let's read. Pen yesh bachem ishu isha, pen niftel libam lehevlei hagoyim. Again, your heart will be influenced by, again, those nations around you. There's 2 different versions to that, either hagoyim or hamoavim. V'shivtem imahem, as you live with them, v'yichshavu levatel kabbalat habrit bilvavam. And then you're going to come to the conclusion in your mind that you are best off canceling your covenant with God. L'chein amarti, shekulam Netzavim lefnei Hashem, and therefore all of you stand in front of God. Bochein klayot v'leiv, God who searches through every person's innards, their hearts. By the way, doesn't that remind you of a Rosh Hashanah type of theme? Of course it does. Which means how many of the commentaries are also influenced because they're also working on their Rosh Hashanah, drasha. They're also working on themselves. They're also thinking Rosh Hashanah is coming next couple of days. So I'm saying that's also interesting, and it comes out now and again. Shelo tuchlu lahatoto, meaning you're not going to fool God. Meaning in your heart, you're going to get to this. Again, he hasn't yet said what it is you're going to get to, the confusion. That you're going to follow corrupt thoughts. You're going to stand with all the other Jews here and accept in your mouth, you're going to accept the covenant. But nonetheless, in your heart, you're going to say, well, I don't really mean that. Lomar shalom yeli. And instead, you say to yourself, I'll be okay. Ki b'shurut libi elech. I'm going to follow my heart. V'inyan ha'hitbarech bilibo, hu sheyomer gam shani makabel la bepi, ani mivatla bilibi v'omer shalom yeli. So again, you hear him very much talking about, and not even in a conflict, but a conflict in terms of there's a larger group, you're standing with the rest of OUisrael, you're going to say whatever it is in that context, that Na'aseh v'nishma, and yes, I will do, and yes, I will obey, and Hashem hu Elokim, and whatever it is that you need to say. But in your heart, you're not there. In your heart, you're someplace else. In your heart, there is this corruption. Let's move a little bit more now. And by the way, if you want to add a 4th, I told you a couple of terms, you also have now bracha uklala. Vayaki yavo alecha kol dvarim ha'ela habracha v'lakala shenatat v'necha v'sheveta el levavecha. Now, over here, this is the end of days. We just now skipped between chapter 29 to chapter 30. In chapter 29, we're standing in front of God about to make a covenant. And in chapter 30, we're many, many, many years, many generations later, when we've broken the covenant, we have consequences from having broken the covenant. And now you have spread out to all kinds of places, gone off into exile. Vashevota el levavecha b'kol hagoyim. Something is going to happen. There's going to be a return. You're going to return to your hearts. Perhaps that's how we should translate it. But something's going to happen. If you want a more of a Kabbalistic concept, there's going to be an awakening. Kabbalah speaks sometimes of an awakening from below and sometimes an awakening from above. But sometimes you have an above, an alarm clock, which wakens us below. Like God is calling us. God stirs something in our hearts. V'shavta Hashem Elokecha. And then you're going to return to God. But notice, of course, the beginning, I'm going to say it again, V'hashevota el levavecha. There's a return. The word shav, shuva, is written in this chapter multiple times. So again, you say, are we talking about shuva now? Are we talking about Shoshana now? And the answer is yeah. Again, the reason why Chazal put it here. Vashivota levecha, right? You're going to come back. V'shavta Hashem Elokecha, v'shamata b'kolo, k'chol she'anochi mitzvcha yom hatov v'necha, b'chol levavcha v'chol nafshecha. So again, something has changed. V'shav Hashem Elokecha. You'll return to God, and God will return to you. V'yechamecha, v'shav, and He's going to gather you from all over. So you see that there's something here very, very biblical. There's something over here, a gathering of the exiles. And we're going to skip a little bit more because this to bring you back to the land. That's really important. Come back to the land. Pasuk Vav, Umal Hashem Elokecha et levavcha vet levav zarecha. And God is going to somehow perform, if you will, a circumcision of your hearts, whatever that means, and cause you to love God, v'chol levavcha v'chol nafshecha. And that will cause you to live. We're going back to life. And again, in the next verse, you're going to come back to God with all your hearts and all your souls. In last week's Parsha, I may or may not have made mention of this. In source number 10, it said, Hayom hazeh, Shem lakech mitzvah l'asot et chukim ha'ela, right? B'chol levavcha v'chol nafshecha. And it said there, we're going to begin our journey really with the Sforno, and look at source 11. It's back in last week's Parsha. You're going to do all of these things l'tov lacha, in order for it to be good for you. Shetakir b'li shum safek, she'ra'ui lasot ritzono. You're going to understand clearly, without any question, that it is worthwhile to do His will. Uv'chol nafshecha, shelo yaniya ota koach mita'ava. So again, He's dealing right here, and I want to make sure that we're clear, that we understand this, and then we can hopefully to get deeper. One of the great qualities that humanity has is our ability to make justifications. Right? Excuse me? It's our ability to make justifications. We can justify anything. Right? We can make excuses for anything. We are terribly creative. How creative are we? Is we can look at something which is objectively bad. By the way, I used a really bad word now, objectively. Objectively bad. Excuse me? Objectively bad, impartially, objectively bad, and convince ourselves that this is absolutely wonderful for us. Yes? That's right. That's who we are. Now, again, the question is, how do we do that? I want to go back to my various terms just to keep them in mind. Again, we added a fourth one: blessing and curses, truth and lies, right? Life and death. Which other one do we have? Tov v'ra, right? I mean, just keep on thinking about all those things. And now I want to read this thing in this Sforno again. L'tov l'cha, he's used the word good. Shetakir b'lisham safek, that you will recognize without any doubt shira'ui lasot ritzono, that it is worthwhile for you to do the will of God. What did he just now say? He's saying you're going to get to this point that you know, you cut through everything, and you know that what you're supposed to do is to serve God. Which means these things, this, again, Yetzer Hara, which brings us away from serving God, which justifies all kinds of things that we do. It's when, again, what verse is he explaining? That you're going to serve God b'chol levavcha v'chol nafshecha, with all your heart and all your soul. What does that mean? That you have absolute clarity. By the way, that is a key word, clarity. You have clarity as far as we're supposed to do, and all the confusion and the fog that we live in gets cut away, and now you know. And again, in a certain sense, what I'm reading here was already in the Bechor Shor. There's somebody else who explains all of this much more, and as I said, hopefully we'll get to that as well. But now let's go to the Sforno in source 12, which was in Perek Lamed, which by this week's Parsha, where it talked about all these issues of return. Vashivotu levecha, hitbonen b'chalkei hasoter v'tishon levecha v'yachid lahavchin ha'emet min hasheker. Okay, so now I want to insist. He knows something. He actually has a book opened in front of him, and he doesn't tell you what the book is. I'll tell you. Don't worry. And he says that you should have the ability to separate, to distinguish. Lavchin. Is there a better word for lavchin? Lavchin. To distinguish what? Distinguish. Lavchin from emet to sheker. So that just like broke through something, because people, again, I can ask you about, endless amounts of things. How could somebody smoke? Right? I can ask such. So what's the answer? Is that they're addicted. Okay, how do you get to that addiction? How do you get to the point of doing something that you know is bad for you? Because why is it bad for you? It's only statistically bad for you, right? It's that you never see people smoking a cigarette and dying on the spot. Maybe that would help more. But being that it doesn't happen immediately, so then you can start to justify, okay, it's only, and all kinds of other things could take place. And I'm using that as an example because that's low-hanging fruit, because I guess most of you don't smoke, and therefore most of you will agree with me. But there's all kinds of things that people do that are bad. They're not right, and they're bad for them, but nonetheless, we have this wonderful capacity to, again, what's the problem is that we sometimes confuse these things. And again, over here, lavchin ha'emet min hasheker. When we're talking about returning to God, what's the first thing we need? Uvizet takir kama rachaktem min hakel yitale b'deot v'nagim shelo k'torato b'chol hagoyim v'otcha b'galut. Which means that when you're off in exile, one of the things that's going to have to take place in order to try to make a historical tikkun, to fix everything, is to stop the influence of these other nations in terms of our thinking process and how we look at the world, in order to stop and to say, Ana avda d'kudshei brichu. I'm a servant of God. And now how do I, what's the word, what's the title for today? How do I recalibrate and get to a point where my mind has clarity in order to be able to no longer be influenced by, again, I can ask you the simple question, and we're getting there sooner or later. How in the world does somebody know that there's a tree of life over here and there's a tree of death over there, and says, I think I'll have the death one, right? I'll have one from column B. I'll take that one. How in the world does anybody ever choose death over life? And the answer is that we can look back in the Garden of Eden and say, look how primitive, look how silly, and yet we know that people are doing it all the time. Yes, do I need to go into details or no? People do this all the time. How do they do this? So what's the first thing? First thing is that there's confusion. And how does that confusion take place? So let's keep reading, because he's saying if you're going to serve God, then there needs to be this type of recalibration to take place. And v'shavta et Hashem lokecha, tiyeh tshuvatcha kedei lasot ritzon koncha bilvad, that I am a servant of God. That becomes the new motivation. Instead of inner motivations, things that motivate me, no, ana od v'kudshei brichu. I'm a servant of God. Lo mitzvot anashim melumada. Now this is really interesting, and I'm going to say this again. You always have to be careful with the Sforno. By the way, he lived a number of years within the shadow of the Vatican. He has all kinds of negative things to say about the Beit HaMikdash. He does not like big buildings. He does not like gold and silver being wasted for religious purposes. He does not trust people who are on high religious influence, people with big jobs like the Pope and so on and so forth. He does not like any of them. And all of this influences. But look what he says over here. You're not going to need, you're not going to need educated people. Knowledge of God will spread in the world, and you're not going to need someone to teach you. He'll come clear to this more. He says, more once you understand the real issue over here, the severity and so on, that's going to help calibrate. That's going to help get you in the right way. More umal Hashem Elokecha. Again, we talked about this circumcision of your hearts. Now, that word, ma'arbev hasechel, that's a great word. It's a great term. That confuses the mind. Irbuvia. What's an irbuvia? What does it mean, erev? What's erev? Erev is a combination of day and night. Right? Erev, in the evening, it's a combination of day and night. Ma'arbev is this confusion, asechel midiata emet. It's all of these mistakes that prevent the intellect from knowing truth. So again, these terms over here, emet, v'sheker, and so on, they're staring at you. That once you get clarity, once you're recalibrated, then everything else becomes clear. And God will give us this ability. And he brings this to this place of finally getting to a messianic age. Is there anything else that I want here? No, we'll leave that for now. We go back to source 13, and yes, this is going all the way back because this is chapter 2 in Bereshit. V'ikach Hashem Elokim et ha'adam v'nicheru b'gan Eden la'ovda u'l'shomra. By the way, what does the word u'la'ovda mean? Excuse me? Yeah, the question is, what's the it here? Well, give me a second. La'ovda u'l'shomra. V'yitzav Hashem Elokim al ha'adam, and God commanded man, Lemor, saying, B'kol eitz hagan ochal tochal. That's a commandment. Eat from every tree. U'me'etz hadat tov v'ra lo tochal mimenu. Do not eat. Now we have this concept of tov v'ra. Don't eat from it. Ki b'yom ha'chochal mimenu mot tumat, because that's going to bring death. And we know that already, if you go back a couple verses, there's another tree that was planted, which is the tree of life. V'yomer Hashem Elokim lo tov yot adam levado eselo ezo kenegdo, which is interesting. You have the eitz hadat tov v'ra and lo tov for man to be by himself. But let's go to the Sforno in source 14. God planted all these trees, mizanotav shelo b'tza'ar. He planted all the food that would be accessible where there would be no pain involved in working it. But again, very simply, you pick the fruit from the tree. Nechmad l'mareh, misameach u'marchiv halev, l'achinu l'kabalat ha'shefa ha'sichli k'omer v'yaken again and again, and so on. Eitz hadat, masi l'teit lev el hatov v'hara. So Eitz Hadat causes there to impact the heart, as it were, we're back to the heart, of a combination of Tov v'Ra. And therefore, Mizeh, Ba'adam Yada, subsequent to eating from the tree. Again, this will get a little bit clearer in a moment. Tov v'Ra, Livchor Ha'arev, Afalpi Sheyazik. So what happens when you eat from the tree, the fruits of this tree of good and bad? Livchor ha'arev afalpi sheyazik. You will then have the ability to choose something. Now, arev is interesting because it could be mixture, or it could be something which is mixed up, and therefore it's tempting. You're going to be able to choose that which is tempting, even though it will hurt you. Here you have eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. causes you to have a worldview that you will choose good and evil and be unable to distinguish between good and evil. Ulama'os habilti arev afal pisha yoel. And that's yoel. That's going to also cause you to have this ability to stay away from and even find disgusting something which is not mixed up, even though it's going to be far more helpful to you. La'ovda, to serve and go back. I would have thought it like you as well. Till I read this, I would have thought la'ovda means to work the land. But he just now told us, but we'll be getting food for free from the trees. Ula ovda, what does he say that it means? La'avod et nishmat chayim. Ka'amru v'yipach b'afav nishmat chayim. The only thing that we were working on at that point was our souls. But by the way, we messed it up. That's part of this. Is there anything else that I want to get to? And then, of course, in Perek Gimel, we have where everything goes wrong. Now, let's be honest about something. We have no idea what we're talking about when we talk about a talking serpent. We don't even know what it means. Asher Asasha Elokim v'yomer ela isha, and the serpent said to the woman, Ki amar Elokim lo tochlu mikol eitz hagan. God said not to eat from every tree of the field, which is a lie. God actually said the opposite. God said to eat from every tree of the field. That's just like the first part here. This is a wonderful way the Yetzer Hara works. It tells you can't have anything. If I follow the rules, I will have nothing. And of course, it was the opposite. If I follow the rules, I'll have everything. But the Yetzer Hara tells you the opposite. If I follow, by the way, right then, should have been a response. Zelo nachon, ze sheker. He also does a little bit, I don't want to pick on lawyers for obvious reasons today, but he does a little bit of an interesting phraseology. You can't eat from every tree of the field. So is that true or is that not true? Is that true or not true? You can't eat from every tree of the field. The problem is the word every. You can't eat from every tree of the field. This is the second way the Yetzer Hara works. You can't eat from every tree of the field. Why? Because there's one tree you can't have. And the one tree you can't have is going to kill you. But listen to the way it comes out. You can't eat from every tree of the field. Well, no, you can't eat from every tree of the field. There's one that you can't eat from. But meaning what the Nachash says is true. You can't eat from every tree of the field because one's really bad for you. We can eat umipriya eitz asher b'toch hagan. By the way, that's also, now is not the time for this. Which tree was described early b'toch hagan? It's actually the Eitz Chaim. There's already confusion here. Lo tochlim menu v'lo tegu. That's the second point of confusion. Pen tamutun. V'yom nachash isha lo mo tamut. You're not going to die. By the way, everything the Nachash says is true. They don't die. Well, death will come in. Because God knows that when you eat it, your eyes will open up. You'll become like God, knowing good and evil. Let's go a little bit over here in source 16. We're still in the Sforno. V'nachash hu Satan, hu Yetzer Hara. Where he's really going with this, he's saying there was no talking snake in the Garden of Eden. He's not even saying that it's a metaphor. He's saying is that there is a dialogue taking place between Eve and between her evil inclination. That's the dialogue taking place. And the way it's described is as a serpent. And so on. And so on. Why is it like a nachash? Because a nachash a nachash could hurt someone with no gain to it. That's his point. I mean, certain animals can attack and they'll gain from the attack. A lion, going back, he mentioned a second, a lion can attack with it, it will eat its prey. He goes, a nachash attacks and doesn't gain anything. He goes, that's the Yetzer Hara. It attacks you, and it's just, ultimately, it does not do anything for it. Asher to'olato b'mitzvot mu'at ma'od, v'nizko rav ad ma'ut hara'ato. V'karmu zechron levarcha, shehu samel rochev alav, this is the evil, this is Satan, v'husha koach ha'mitaveh, the power within us, the desire, it uses our imaginations. This is what's really interesting, because it's as if he's saying that no, there was no serpent there. But the way that the Yetzer Hara works is it impacts our imaginations, and it allows us to imagine such a wonderful world which will exist as a result of our bad choices that we make. So this imagination then creates this this being that doesn't exist, which means the Yetzer Hara as itself becomes incarnate. And now you have a Nachash, which is there convincing me to do that which is bad for me. But he's saying all of this is a matter of what happens within my imagination, which is part of the sin process. Yeah. That is exactly what we wanted to get to. That's the point. That's exactly the point. Very good. Okay, no, excuse me. Very good. And who's the one who raises this question? But who raises it before the Sorno? And the answer is somebody who had a conversation about this with the Rambam, and he writes a book called The Guide for the Perplexed. So you may be perplexed right now. But that's good. To be the Rambam's perplexed is not a bad thing to be. But we'll see this in a moment, because that's all that the Sforno is really doing over here. Is he's been explaining the Rambam in the Moreh Nevuchim. Why he doesn't bother telling us, I don't know. I have to assume that his audience in the Middle Ages, any intellectual in the Middle Ages, I have to assume that they knew this without any question whatsoever. But that's exactly the point. Which means
How many years after the Rambam?
hundreds of years after. Hundreds of years after, but that's what he's doing. That's exactly the point over here, and we'll see some of the Moreh Nevuchim hopefully in a couple of minutes. But again, he's talking about how sin creates imagination, which is wonderful. You imagine all the pleasure and all the wonderful things that will happen when you sin. Essentially, there's this inner battle taking place in our minds, in our imaginations, in our desires. We, on the one hand, create this world which is going to be so pleasurable, so wonderful, so vibrant, and that is this world of sin, and this is all a world of illusion. And we then completely convince ourselves about all the bad. Now, the question is a wonderful question. If eating from the tree is what's going to cause us to have a world where we are confused, so then what kind of confusion can cause us to eat from the world, from this tree, which is going to be the source of confusion? Did I explain your question properly? Yes. And that is again, not taking away nothing from you. I mean, the fact that Rambam says what he does, that's a wonderful, wonderful question. By the way it's asked of the Rambam is even better. We'll give me a second, but I think we have enough of this to get a sense of where we're going. Look at source number 18. Some years ago, a learned man, by the way, I figured that once we're not reading the Arabic, the English is no worse than the Hebrew, right? You agree with me on that? Okay. Some years ago, a learned man asked me a question of great importance. It would appear, and you see I skipped about, it would at first sight appear from Scripture that man was originally intended to be perfectly equal to the rest of the animal creation, which is not endowed with intellect, reason, or power of distinguishing between good and evil. Notice the words over here, good and evil. What's good and evil? Go back to Hebrew for a second. What's good and evil? TORAH. Why? Because we were not supposed to be able to distinguish in Tov and Ra. What allowed us to distinguish in Tov and Ra? Only when we ate from the tree of Tov and Ra. So therefore, if we were not supposed to eat from the tree, that means we were not supposed to have the understanding of Tov and Ra. But that Adam's disobedience to the command of God procured him the great perfection, which is the peculiarity of man, the power to distinguish between good and evil, the noblest of all faculties of our nature, the essential characteristic of human race. It thus appears strange that the punishment for rebelliousness should be the means of elevating man to the pinnacle of perfection to which he had not obtained previously. So his question is actually a little bit sharper. It's not just, how does this happen? That's going to be part of the answer as well. How does this happen? He's saying, if the purpose is for man, If man becomes a being to be able to distinguish good and bad, that only takes place after eating from the tree of good and bad. If you can't distinguish the good and bad, that means you're no different from any of the animals. So then how does man become man if not from eating from the tree? And why is that part of the plan? Why is that only considered a sin, which brings on this whole world of pain? So what's the Rambam going to need to do? First of all, again, the question is really good. But in terms of the answer or the response to this, it is not to be understood as you think at first sight, but as you will find after due deliberation, namely, the intellect which was granted to man as the highest of man was bestowed on him before his disobedience. With reference to this gift, the Bible states that man was created in the form likeness of God. On account of this gift of intellect was addressed by God and received his commandments. And the Lord commanded it, which means no matter what you say, you cannot command an animal not to choose between good and bad, which means the commandments are absurd. That's part of the Rambam's point. Adam was created at the end of chapter 1. He's created, again, another description at the beginning of chapter 2. In chapter 2, Adam was commanded certain things, by the way, included L'ovda u'l'shomra, by the way, now you realize that, come to the Sforno, l'shomra means to save this ability, which is this Spirit of God that he gave you. L'shomra is to guard your humanity, to guard your tselem Elokim within you, which again is really interesting because all of us always imagine that it means l'ovda l'shomra means that the thing you should be working on is Garden of Eden, save the Garden of Eden, and the Sforno is telling us no, you should be saving man. But I'm going to say it again. The Sforno has this Rambam open up right in front of us as he's telling this. And he continues and he says, and the Lord God commanded it, for no commandments are given to brute creation or to those who are devoid of understanding. Through the intellect, man distinguishes between the true and the false. Now notice something he just now shifted. He says that Adam, when he was created, had the ability of distinguishing between emet v'sheker, truth and falsehood. Then he eats from tov v'ra, and that's good and bad. Part of what the Rambam is going to get to here is that truth and falsehood and good and bad are not always the same. Because truth and falsehood are, should we get back to that word again? If you're willing to accept it, are objective. Truth and false are objective. Of course, we live in a world where there is this incredible assault upon truth. There's assault upon truth, there's assault upon language, there's assault upon biology, there's assault on all kinds of things. But nonetheless, again, the Rambam is telling us that Adam, before the sin, had a complete ability of distinguishing between true and falsehood. But what happened to the beginning of the tree, that's when you get to this confusion between good and bad. What happens when you get to confusion of good and bad? So let me go back a step. I have true and I have false. Could I choose what's bad? Yeah. I know it's false. I know it's a lie. Can I choose those lies? Yes. That's before the sin. There's a clarity, right? Truth and false. After the sin, we get impacted, and then we no longer know what is truth and what is a lie, and therefore we live in a world which is a confusion of good and bad. And now I can justify my bad and say that it's really good, which means that's what happens with sin. There's obviously a lot more to say about this, and obviously also we have to wind down and get towards a conclusion. The verses that we read are very easy to understand only, as the Sforno even gave away. This is the end of days, and this is what's going to happen when the knowledge of God will fill the world, and then we'll be able to get to this point of a recalibration, and everyone's going to understand that there's one God, and so on and so forth. And truth will be, again, absolutely manifest, and so on. Nonetheless, every single year, as we're getting towards Rosh Hashanah, we can just, try to say, okay, listen, maybe I spoke too much Lashon Hara, and maybe I got angry too quickly with somebody, and maybe I didn't drive as nicely as I could have, or maybe, and I can go on and on and on along the way, picking on little things. But I think what we can take away from all of this is this need for a recalibration, is this need to really go back to really basic issues, and have I convinced myself that something which is really, okay, Do I live a world which is a lie? Have I confused truth and falsehood? Have I been able to be the victim of this combination of good and bad, and then justify bad and convince myself that it's good, and then by extension convince myself that I live in a world of truth as well? Which means the process of tshuva is not just a process of picking on a list of things. I can do this better, I can do this better, I can do that better, but rather a much larger, again, what's the word? Recalibration, and saying, do I have a clarity? Okay, by the way, I don't have to consider, I can finish that sentence. Do I have clarity? Do I see things clearly? Do I understand what truth is? When it comes down to it, truth is very closely aligned with Ananda of the Kucha Brichu. I kept quoting that phrase. I am a servant of God. If I'm a servant of God, I'm here to serve God. And therefore, what God asks me to do is essentially a definition of what is good. That is the tree of life. That's what brings life. When I have this combination of bracha and klala and blessings and curses, and choose life, choosing life is choosing the Eitz Chaim. Choosing the Eitz Chaim means choosing Torah. Choosing Torah means essentially choosing what God has commanded. And my worldview could be that I have all kinds of justifications and reasons why that's not really good for me. So now I know that I need a recalibration. And I need to put myself within a mindset of now trying to get back to the core issues. What is good and what is bad? What is truth and what is falsehood? And once I'm able to do that, then I'm able to emerge out of this by saying, okay, this is what I'm here. This is what I'm here to do. I'm here to serve God. Let me now process these mitzvot. Again, I'm not saying that all this is easy, but what I'm saying is that tshuva is not just a question of fixing a couple of things along the way. It's a process of recalibration. That's really what the point is over here. And to realize, as the Sforno was explaining this, and he keeps on doing this. It was in chapter 26, and it was in chapter 29, and it's in chapter 30, and he keeps coming back to this point. And it's also in Bereishit and Perek Bet, and it's Perek Gimel, which means essentially what we're going through here at the end of the Torah is the same thing that went on in the very beginning of the Torah. Now you go, okay, so what happened? What changed? So what changed was this wonderful ability to justify wrong that we do. What this foreigner was claiming, and again, this is based on the Rambam and Avuchim, is that before the sin, and you have to go back clearly, look at the conversation between Eve and the Nachash, is that the Nachash says all that he says, and what is it that say that her response is? If you want, what verse was that? If you look at the whole conversation, Pasuk Dalid, the Nachash says, you're not going to die, in Pasuk Hey, he tries to convince, and you'll be like God, Pasuk Vav, Vatera isha ki tova eitz lamachal v'ki tavahu la'inayim v'nechmadhu lahaskil. That all the arguments that he gave get left on the side, and there's one word there that really troubles me, ta'ava, lust. Once there's lust, then everything else is going to fit in, which means if you would have asked her right then, is this good or bad? She would have said, I know it's bad, but I need to do it. That's the difference between beforehand and afterwards. Beforehand, there could have been, or there probably was, and I think there was, I think that's what the Rambam is claiming. Beforehand, there was an acknowledgement and knowledge that I am giving into lust, and this is really, really bad, and it's going to have really bad consequences. After you do that, now you live in a world of confusion, which means this is in a certain sense what Chazal say, avera megoreret avera, is that sin causes you to justify your behavior, your sin, and I have to justify it. You want to live with cognitive dissonance. You want to say, okay, that basically whoever said that you shouldn't do that didn't know what he's talking about. And that is not really bad for you. And then you end up getting into a confused worldview. And living in a confused worldview, you have to constantly justify the things that you do. And now you create in your own mind a system of what is right and wrong. And you even get to the point of what is truth and what is falsehood. So essentially, I'm going to go back again. So what do we now need to do at the end of the year? Going at the end of Elul, going into Rosh Hashanah, into Yom Kippur. What do we need to do? We need to recalibrate. We need to go back to basic assumptions. We need to go back and ask ourselves, okay, what is true and what is false? How did lust affect our choices, affect us to get into a world of confusion, and once in a world of confusion that we can no longer see what's right and what's wrong anymore? So what do we need to do? We need to recalibrate. That's really hard to do. So one of the things we need to pray to God is before we begin, ending with this. Before we begin, to God, give me clarity. God, help me see things clearly. God, open up my mind and open up my heart and let me look at things in a way which they really are. And that then becomes the beginning point to be able to really make meaningful changes. Everybody have a Shabbat Shalom and have a K'tiva v'Chatima Tova.